you to think about though is the fonts you choose for this and how they relate to the subject matter. So one of the things that I wanted to go through tonight is a couple more features of the type tool. And there's some really nice kind of hidden features almost. I was working on this portrait of Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. So Mary Shelley is really considered to be the person who helped launch science fiction with Frankenstein. And I was just kind of tracing her out. Instead of using the image trace tool, I was just drawing out her outlines with the pen tool. Actually, the curvature tool, and that's another approach. You don't have to use the image trace tool if you don't want to, as long as you can capture the silhouette. Here I'm just like drawing with the curvature tool. Another thing is, one way to use the tool is to keep the fill turned on and the stroke turned off, and then to create your different different lines to represent that character by just using stylized strokes that are actually shapes like this. So I keep it filled in just to give it a nice style. So that's one way of keeping some control over it. So you don't need to image trace all the time. You can actually trace like this using the technique where you have a template layer and then you're drawing these lines on top. So you get something that is a little bit more graphic in its feel. So that's one way that you can go about this assignment. But I really wanted to talk about type and some features of the type tool. So I kind of talked about like adding type to a curve, adding type to a shape, filling a shape with type. Something about the fonts themselves though to think about. So when you go into your type menu and you go into fonts, on the side to the left where you see this abbreviation, these little icons basically, you see like an O, you see double T, and then you see a cloud with a check mark. So these are different indicators for your fonts. This double T, it stands for true type. So that's pretty old type format. It's one of the earliest type formats. One of the original type formats actually for fonts. So you download a font somewhere, or somebody would give you a font, and it would be a true type font, and you install that font, and you can only install it on the operating system that it was designed for. So you had Mac true types and you had PC true types, and they weren't interchangeable. Well, this O is a relatively new format, and it stands for OpenType. And what's nice about OpenType is it has a lot more features than a true type font. And if you get any of the fonts from Adobe fonts, they're most likely going to be true type fonts. They're most likely going to be open type fonts. Almost like I think all the fonts from Adobe fonts are open type fonts. So I went to OpenType, and you get your open type fonts just by going to more fonts from Adobe. Now, I'm not sure how this works if you have the PCC software. I think it should work the same. You need to use your Adobe ID to get into Adobe fonts. If you go to the website, fonts.adobe.com, it's like clicking on that button in Illustrator, and you just log in. You have all these options here. And so one of the things that's kind of nice about the way they do this, though, besides these tags, this is all kind of new. Even though the tags are not reflective of the history of type itself. You don't see the different categories common among fonts throughout history, such as grotesques or transitionals, which is something I'll talk about more. But it has this one feature called font packs. I don't know if you've seen this, but if you click on font packs, these are groups of curated fonts from different people at Adobe or different well-known typographers. So they're kind of putting fonts together that work together, and fonts that just fall into like different themes. For example, like one example here, this set fonts designed by women. Ellen Lupton is a designer and a typographer, and she put together these fonts that were designed by well-known female typographers. So you can download these individually or as a group. But then what they do with Adobe is they create this nice kind of panel that displays variations of the fonts. And this is common when you visit websites for type, which are normally called foundries, font foundries, which is kind of a throwback to when fonts were developed as metal and it was a foundry process. So the font foundry was the company that created certain sets of fonts. And in font catalogs, they would always do this sort of arrangement of some sort, displaying the type. So that's what they're doing with these font packs. So these are nice to explore. If you're thinking about historically who you're choosing for this assignment, this could probably help you with some ideas because the categories are nicely structured. Like, for example, let's see, like, there's some ones that are kind of basic, but then there's ones that are more specific. Like the high contrast is really interesting. So high contrast meaning that there's thick and thin parts of the font that make the font stand out. So maybe if, you know, some of these too have like a retro 50s feel. So let's say you picked like, you know, a popular figure from the 50s, like James Dean or Elvis, let's say, you know, it might be nice to look into something like these. So I was looking through these, and one of the fonts that I was looking for was more of a historical font. So I was looking for Adobe Garamond, and that's the font I chose for this Mary Shelley idea that I was working on. And one of the reasons that I chose, that's not Garamond. Here I did a search for Garamond. But I chose Garamond because Garamond is known for some really nice ligatures. So the term ligature comes into play, especially with your italic fonts. And it's important to remember that italic fonts are specifically designed a certain way. It's not just a slanted font. I think in Microsoft Word, you can pick italics, but it just kind of skews the font. But italic fonts are designed specifically to have a certain look and feel. So, for example, let me see if I can make these bigger. If you look at the E, for example, it's not just a slanted E when you look at the italic version. You know, the italic version actually has a totally different structure than the non-italic version. Just the way that the counter, the inside of that E is designed. The serif on the H on the italic version is rounded. So it has a very specific look and feel that's designed specifically as an italic font. Well, what is nice about Garamond is this idea of ligature. So right here where the T and the H connect, that's designed to be that way. It's not just a T and an H that has been moved closer together. The T and the H has been designed specifically to connect like that. And there are a whole series of these um, nicely stylized letter pairings that really add to the look and feel of the font itself and the way that the type is laid out on the page. It gives it like a certain type of elegance. You could say when you have these very thought out designs in the way that the characters are connecting. So if I decided to use this font, I picked it, I hit activate, and now it's here. So what Adobe Illustrator and InDesign has this too, is a feature now where if I highlight these fonts, let's say I wait, you got to wait a little bit. So you use the type tool, you highlight a character in the font itself, and this little submenu pops up, and you have these alternates in the submenu. Sometimes when you go over, you have to, depends on the character that you go over if it has that submenu. But for example, let me do the uppercase letters here. Like in a name for Mary Shelley, there is this alternate M, which has this nice swash that comes out from the M. In the same way with the S, there's this really nice alternate S that kind of overhangs over the baseline. So when you have that little blue line underneath, it's bringing up these alternate characters. And where it's grabbing these from is a menu called the Glyph panel. So if you go into Windows and you go into type, there's Glyphs right here. And I already have it open. So now if I look at Glyphs here, you can see all these alternates. So there's, if I go down, there's my alternate S. If you click on show up here, you can see the entire font, and then you can actually see that there's a lot more characters than you may have realized in that font. And this is where you can access all of these characters. Now, if you look over here, where these characters are combined, the TH, that's a ligature. So that's where you can find your ligatures. So SP is one. So here I can highlight the SP in the text and double click on that, and then I get that nice connection between the S and the P itself. So it's specifically designed, so it's a flourish in the font itself. It's something that you would almost see like on a, like a wedding invitation, some sort of announcement, something that is very formal. It's very formal in its approach. So that right there is the ligature. And I think if you look in the unit, that terminology for the connecting thing, I think it's called like a gadzook for some reason, but the characteristics and the terminology for different parts of the pipe, sometimes that's called a gadzook. I don't know why, but if you look inside the unit, I have more terms for different parts of type. So here in the glyph palette, you find all of these variations. Another nice variation is the ampersand, and I think you can, let's see, different ampersands. These are really nice. You have different title cases, and here are your alternates with your different swooshes coming out of these characters. And then you even have little dingbats as well, which are nice too. So the glyphs have all these additional features that you may not realize that belong to that font that you choose. Accented characters. And if you go here under show, you can see the differences. So here's all the swashes. stylistic sets. So these are different styles, and some of these are usually for different languages too. Alternates. So a lot of different variations. And then here is where you find your ligatures under standard ligatures. So most of these open type fonts have these ligature sets as part of the fonts. That's what's nice about open type. I think true type, you can only have so many characters in true type font. And then when open type was developed, you could have a lot more characters in the open type font. There's some interesting variations there as well. So there's a lot of things to explore. So when you're thinking about the design of what you're doing for that person that you pick, the historical reference, think about stylistically what you can add. If it's something that it should be more formal, then maybe you play with these ligatures, you know, and explore and see what you can find here that adds to the relevant historical meaning behind the image that you chose. So, you know, I always like to kind of add these flourishes, especially if it's someone that holds like this kind of like revered place in history. You know, adding the flourishes really add to the character of that person. And then a couple other things with the type tool. If you use the type tool and you click once, it's always going to bring this lorem ipsum, but that's just a line of text. So if you click once, you get this line of text. Or if I click and I paste my text in there, it's just putting the text on the baseline. If you click the type tool and drag, it creates a text box. And if I fill this with text, you can go to type, fill with placeholder text. And let's say I'm just going to select this and I'm going to cut and paste it inside the box a couple times. What happens is the text that you cut and paste is going beyond the boundaries of the box. So there's actually more text there. And with the text box, if you use your regular select tool, B, and then click on this little plus sign here. So there's a plus sign on the box. So I'll zoom in. Tiny. But what that means is you have more text. So if you have a text box in the plus sign, use the regular selection tool, click on it, and then the cursor changes, and the cursor looks like a little page with lines of text in it. That means you have additional text that you can drag out. And then these lines that connect basically means that this text here will flow into the next box. So then I can connect, grab that box, and they're all flowing together. So, you know, what you could do, let me just let's say I'm going to grab some text from, I'll grab Frankenstein out of here. So this is another, so last time I grabbed Dracula, and this is another book that you can just find the PDF of Frankenstein. So I'm just going to cut and paste text in there. Make it smaller. So you see though, when I cut and paste text in there, it just flows. And here with that M for my bodies, sometimes it's nice to begin paragraph with a nice flourish on the character. So those are just some additional basic features of the type tool. So the text box, flowing from one box to the other, and the ability to add ligatures to certain fonts using the glyph palette. So those are two things I wanted to show you as you work on this, and to think about adding these flourishes to individual characters, kind of, you know, thinking about the design, and as you refine it, get to a stage where you're refining it, you can add some of these nice little details to what you're working on. So any questions about anything, or I just wanted to kind of show you those two aspects of Adobe Illustrator. And these are features too that carry into InDesign as you start to deal more with typography. So these are two features to really keep in mind, because they actually carry into the other tools. And even Photoshop has this glyph palette as well. But this is where you can really, you know, fine tune a font and really get into details. That's kind of like the aspect of when you get into typography, is getting into these very like subtle details that, you know, just add to the quality of the design that you're working on. So, so yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to show you. Is there any questions?
Would you recommend us just sticking with the one font, or could we use another font too?
Yeah, I use more than one font, but think about the relationship between the two fonts. If you pick two fonts or even three fonts, you know, think about contrast. You know, how do fonts work together? There's certain like pairings of fonts that just kind of work well together. So, you know, if you use a serif, you know, think about a sans serif. You know, if you're using Garamond, you know, it's kind of makes no sense to use something that looks so similar to Garamond that it doesn't like pop out at you, you know, or stand out. So think about the contrast. So if you use Garamond and maybe use like Gil Sans, or, you know, another like sans serif font, so there's some sort of, you know, this like rhythm in the structure of the design, you know, compositionally becomes more balanced if you balance the, you know, the elegance of a serif with the kind of the impactful directness of like a sans serif. So think about balance and fonts that complement each other.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, definitely use more than one. And then you can think about too, you can get into the history, you know, think about if you have a historical figure, do a search, you know, for when that historical figure was known in that time period. So if it's a historical figure from the 70s, kind of think about sans serif and serif fonts from the 70s, you know, see how the two kind of relate to each other coming from that time period. So that's, yeah, that's a good question. Is there any other questions? So is everybody coming along then with their assignments so far, with the deadlines?
Yeah, my computer is a little slow, so I feel like this project is like kind of dragging for me, but I'm mostly there.
Yeah, I mean, if it's too slow, try to think about the vectors that you're using and try not to, maybe you simplify things a little bit. You know, watch the layers and then go into outline mode. I like to go into outline mode a lot just to see the actual vectors themselves, to make sure I don't have any vectors that have a hidden stroke or a hidden fill, because they'll be invisible when they're not in outline mode, and you can have like vectors there that you don't even realize. And then you go into outline mode, and then you use your direct selection tool to just clean things up. So yeah, you might want to figure out how you can optimize a little bit. Any other questions? So that's all I wanted to talk about with the fonts, because there's other features that we can get into, but I don't want people going crazy in terms of distorting. You know, there's all these type effects, and we'll talk about them more. If you go into the style palette and then you bring up these libraries, you have different effects, you know, but they're too wild and they're kind of cheesy, and they kind of remind me of like kind of cheap effects from like the late 90s or something. So I don't necessarily care for them, but they're there, and they appear with this appearance palette too. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. So I really want people to be thinking about just the fonts themselves and the shapes and the forms and how they can be changed different ways. One more thing is there's this palette that is part of the open type palette where it will actually tell you as you hover over a font what category that font's in. So there's some other things here too where you can play with the types of fonts here as well, but it kind of indicates if you do have a ligature here. So if you unclick it, you see how the ligature goes away and it just goes back to the two characters. Same with the T and the H. If I unclick that here, it goes back. So you can kind of use this as well if you want to go between the different stylized characters and the non-stylized. So it's the open type window here. It's part of the type menu down below. So there's that feature too. So yeah, so anyways, yeah, that's all I wanted to get into is this. And then have you been watching any of the other videos at all? Or some of this is kind of, some of these tools now, once you get the hang of Illustrator, it's pretty straightforward, I think, as you learn Illustrator. So, you know, hopefully they help you. But if you have any questions, just, you know, contact me on Discord, and I'm always there. Or you can do like a one-on-one type meeting, like a one-on-one Zoom if you need some additional help. And you can always take a screenshot of what you're doing and put it in Discord on your private line, and then ask my opinion, and I can help you, you know, if you want some, you know, if you want a personal critique as you're working. So I can offer that to you as well. So that's it for tonight then. And I'm going to sign off. So, all right. Yeah. Have a good night, and stay cool. It's like hot these couple of days. So I will talk to you guys next week.
Thank you, Professor.
All righty. Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.